The monitor screamed a flat, endless tone. Nurses shouted numbers I couldn't understand anymore. Someone was pressing on my chest so hard I thought my ribs would crack, and somewhere very far away a phone was ringing in a hospital hallway. My stepmother picked it up. She listened to a doctor tell her I might die. Then she said 7 words that would end our family forever. "We still have 7 days in Napa." She hung up, and I flatlined. I don't remember the exact moment my heart stopped. That's the strange mercy of it, you don't get to witness your own dying. 1 second I was walking across the motor pool at Fort Campbell, clipboard in hand, going over maintenance logs with Sergeant Alvarez, and the next thing I knew the world tilted sideways, and the sky came rushing up to meet me. I remember the taste of copper in my mouth. I remember Alvarez's voice high and cracking, screaming for a medic. I remember thinking absurdly that I still had 3 more vehicles to inspect before lunch. Then nothing. Just darkness and the sound of my own heartbeat slowing down like a clock running out of batteries. My name is Lucy Price. I'm 32 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon I had spent nearly 12 years serving this country as a logistics officer, working my way up to major through deployments, field exercises, and enough sleepless nights to fill a lifetime. I built a career out of discipline. I built a life out of self-reliance because somewhere along the way I learned that I couldn't count on anyone else to catch me if I fell. I suppose that's what made the irony so sharp. The one time in my life I truly needed someone to catch me, I was already on the ground. The Army medics worked on me for what the after-action report later called an extended resuscitation event. In plain English, they brought me back from the edge of death more than once. While they did that, while my body fought for every ragged breath, someone made the standard call. "Emergency contact. Father. Robert Price." Linda answered his phone. I wasn't conscious for that call, but I heard about it later piece by piece from a nurse who couldn't quite look me in the eye when she told me. The doctor explained the severity: cardiac arrest, uncertain prognosis, possible surgery. And Linda, calm as a Tuesday afternoon, told him they were already at the airport. Non-refundable tickets, a wine country getaway they'd been planning for months. "If she wakes up," Linda said, "tell her to call us later." Then she hung up. I think about that phrase more than I probably should. If she wakes up. Not when. Not even "please keep us updated." Just a conditional clause tossed away like a scheduling conflict. To understand how we got here, how a stepmother could say something like that about a dying woman and feel nothing, you have to go back further to when I was 15, and my mother was still alive. My mom, Diane, was the kind of woman who filled a room with warmth just by walking into it. She baked on Sundays, not because she was trying to be some picture-perfect homemaker, but because she loved the smell of it, loved watching my father steal warm rolls straight off the cooling rack while pretending he hadn't. She used to tell me that family wasn't about blood, it was about who shows up. I didn't understand yet how much that sentence would come to define my entire life. She died of ovarian cancer 11 months after her diagnosis. I was 15. My father was gutted. I remember him sitting in the driveway some nights just staring at nothing, like grief had hollowed him out from the inside. I didn't blame him for struggling. I understood loss even then in my own fumbling teenage way. What I didn't understand, what I still don't fully understand, is how quickly he filled that void. Linda came into our lives less than a year later. She was polished, put together, the kind of woman who complimented you while somehow making you feel smaller. At first I told myself I was imagining things. I was young, grieving. Maybe I was looking for reasons to resent her, but the reasons kept finding me on their own. Small things at first. She'd forget to tell me about family dinners. She'd rearrange the living room and quietly donate my mother's photographs to make space for her own decor. She'd correct me in front of guests, gently, sweetly, in a tone that made me sound difficult if I ever pushed back. My father started listening to her more than he listened to me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a tide pulling out so gradually you don't notice the shore has changed until you're standing in water up to your knees. I tried for years to hold on to some version of a relationship with him. I called on birthdays, I sent updates about my career, my promotions, my life. I told myself that eventually he'd remember whose daughter he was, that eventually it would matter to him that I existed outside of Linda's careful architecture of our family. It never seemed to. And now, on a gurney in an army hospital with my heart barely beating and a team of medics fighting to keep me alive, the man who was supposed to be the first person notified wasn't even the one who answered. I didn't know any of this yet, not in the moment. In the moment, there was only darkness and the fading rhythm of my own pulse, and somewhere in the distance, a monitor's long, flat tone stretching out like a scream nobody in that airport terminal could hear. I didn't die. I want to start part 2 with that, because I know how the last one ended with that flat tone stretching into silence, and I don't want to make you sit in that fear any longer than I had to sit in it myself. My heart came back, not gently, not easily, but it came back. The medical team at Fort Campbell worked on me for 11 minutes, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that most people don't come back after 4. 11 minutes is the kind of number that makes doctors write papers. 11 minutes is the kind of number that makes nurses cry in supply closets after their shift ends. I know, because one of them told me later when she thought I was still too sedated to remember it. She didn't know I'd carry that memory for the rest of my life tucked away like a secret. The following weeks are hazy in my memory, stitched together from fragments. There was a surgery to address the underlying issue, a congenital defect in my heart's electrical system that had apparently been ticking like a bomb since birth, waiting for the wrong combination of stress and exhaustion to set it off. There were complications afterward. An infection. A second, smaller procedure. Days blurred into each other under fluorescent lights, punctuated by beeping machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses checking my vitals every few hours. Through all of it, I kept waiting. I told myself it was normal to expect nothing from a hospital room. I've deployed. I've spent years learning not to need anyone. But there's a difference between choosing independence and being confronted with the absence of people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. No calls, no texts, no flowers wilting on the windowsill, no worried voice asking the nurses for updates. I watched other patients in the cardiac wing get visited by husbands, daughters, entire extended families, crowding into tiny rooms with balloons and coloring books for the grandkids. I lay in my bed hooked to an IV, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in years, the specific quiet loneliness of being forgotten by the people who share your blood. One of the night nurses, a woman named Teresa with kind eyes and a no-nonsense voice, finally asked me about it during a particularly slow shift. She'd noticed the empty visitor's log by my bed. She asked carefully if my family lived far away. I told her the truth. I didn't know where they were. I assumed they knew where I was. She didn't say anything else that night, but I saw the way her jaw tightened, the way she double-checked my chart before leaving the room, like she wanted to make absolutely sure anyone was paying attention to me, since apparently my own family wasn't. It was around day 9 that Colonel Whitfield came to see me. I'd worked under his command for 2 years by that point, and though we weren't close in any personal sense, there was a mutual respect between us, the kind built through long hours and hard decisions, not through friendship. He sat in the plastic chair beside my bed, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, and asked me directly, "Major Price, where is your father?" I remember looking at him and feeling, for the first time since waking up in that hospital, a strange kind of clarity settle over me. "I don't know, sir," I said. "I assume he's still on vacation." Whitfield's expression didn't change much. He was too disciplined a man to let something like shock show plainly on his face, but something in his eyes hardened. He told me in a measured voice that the hospital had made multiple attempts to reach my father. Voicemails, text messages, even a call to a secondary number listed for my stepmother. None of them had been returned. I sat with that information the way you sit with a verdict you already suspected, but hoped somewhere small and foolish inside you would come back different. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness, not really, not the sharp, immediate kind. It was something quieter and more permanent. It was the feeling of a door closing softly somewhere deep in my chest, a door I hadn't realized I was still holding open. I thought about my mother, about the Sunday mornings, and the warm rolls stolen off the cooling rack, about her voice telling me that family is about who shows up. And I thought about the man who used to be my father, standing in a vineyard somewhere in Napa Valley, swirling wine in a glass, while his daughter's heart had stopped beating in an army hospital 3 states away. Something in me settled after that. Not anger exactly, anger burns too hot to last. This was colder, steadier. The kind of decision you make once and never have to make again. Before Colonel Whitfield left my room that evening, I asked him for a form, the kind used to update emergency contact information for active duty personnel. He looked at me for a long moment, understanding passing between us without either of us saying it aloud. Then he nodded and told me he'd have someone bring it up within the hour. That night, under the dim hum of hospital lighting, I picked up a pen with a hand still weak from weeks of recovery and I crossed out my father's name. I didn't cry doing it. I want you to understand that. There was no dramatic breakdown, no tears splattering onto the paperwork like some movie scene. There was only quiet, deliberate resolve, the kind that comes only after you've given someone every chance in the world and they've shown you clearly and repeatedly exactly who they are. If they didn't need me in the moment that mattered most, then I decided right there in that hospital bed that I no longer needed them either. While I lay in that hospital bed making the quiet decision that would change the rest of my life, my father and Linda were 3 states away living out the kind of vacation people post about, with captions full of gratitude they don't actually feel. I know the details now pieced together later from photographs from a lawyer's records, from the kind of digital trail people leave behind when they think no one is paying attention. I know because eventually, much later, I forced myself to look at it all the way. You force yourself to look at a wound before you can properly dress it. Napa Valley in early autumn is beautiful, if you care about that sort of thing. The vineyards turn gold and amber, the air smells like fermenting grapes and wood smoke, and every restaurant patio is filled with couples toasting to nothing in particular, except the simple pleasure of being alive and unbothered. My father and Linda had booked a week at a boutique inn nestled between 2 wineries, the kind of place with $1,000 a night rooms and a concierge who remembers your name. There's a photo from their second day there, I found it later, and I've never quite been able to unsee it. My father is standing in front of a row of grapevines, one arm around Linda's waist, holding a glass of red wine up to the camera like a toast. Linda is laughing at something outside the frame. The caption reads, "Family First." I read that caption more times than I probably should have. I turned it over in my mind like a stone I couldn't stop touching, searching for some hidden meaning that might make it hurt less. There wasn't one. It was just what it looked like, a phrase people use when they've stopped thinking about what it actually means. According to the phone records that came out later, the hospital called my father's cell phone directly 4 times over the course of that week. Linda intercepted each one. She never once handed him the phone. When he did notice the missed calls buzzing against the nightstand, she reportedly waved it off with the same casual dismissal each time. "It's probably nothing," she told him, according to a conversation my father later admitted to, though I suspect his memory of his own guilt is more generous to himself than the truth deserves. "You know how she gets. She's probably just having one of her moments." One of her moments. That's the phrase Linda used to describe my dying, apparently. A moment. Like a mood swing. Like something a teenager does for attention rather than a cardiac event that nearly ended a 32-year-old woman's life on a military base 4 states away. I've come to understand, a particular skill some people have, a talent almost for reframing inconvenient truths into manageable narratives. Linda had spent years perfecting this with me specifically. Every time I raised a concern, every time I pointed out some slight, real or perceived, she had a way of making it sound like the problem was my sensitivity, my dramatics, my inability to simply let things go. She turned my grief over, losing my mother, into me not adjusting well. She turned my discomfort with being replaced in my own home into me struggling to accept change. So when the hospital called about my heart stopping, of course, it was easy for her to file it under the same old category, Lucy being Lucy, making something out of nothing, needing attention as always. My father, to his credit, and I say that carefully because credit is a complicated thing to extend to him even now, did begin to feel something shift in him as the week went on. There's a text message retrieved much later where he wrote to an old army buddy of his, "Something feels off. Lucy hasn't texted back in days. That's not like her." His friend responded with something non-committal, and my father let the thought slide back under the surface the way people do when confronting something feels harder than ignoring it. By the 5th day, according to what he later told me in the one real conversation we ever had about all of this, something in him had started to gnaw. He mentioned quietly over dinner that maybe they should call the base directly just to check in. Linda's response verbatim as he recalled it, "Don't let her ruin our trip. We've been planning this for months." And so he didn't call. Not that night, not the next morning. He let the vacation run its full course, the wine tastings, the spa afternoon, the sunset dinner on their final evening, all of it happening while I underwent a second surgical procedure to address complications from the first. It wasn't until their final day packing suitcases in a hotel room smelling faintly of lavender bath products that my father finally dialed my number. It rang, and rang, and rang. No answer, because my phone had been sitting powered off in a hospital locker for over a week, its battery long dead, its owner unconscious more often than not. He told himself I was angry with him. That's the story he settled on, the explanation that required the least from him, that his daughter was simply upset about something trivial and was giving him the silent treatment. It never occurred to him, not once during that entire week, that the truth might be so much darker than mere anger. He didn't know that I had already crossed his name off a hospital form. He didn't know that somewhere inside me a door had quietly shut. By the time they boarded their flight home, tanned and rested and completely unaware, I had already been discharged from the hospital. But I didn't go back to the apartment they knew. I didn't go back to any place they could find. The apartment I'd lived in for 3 years sold faster than I expected. I hadn't planned to sell it originally. I'd simply started making calls from my hospital bed in those final days, before discharge, driven by something that felt less like decision-making and more like instinct, the kind of clarity that arrives only after you've stopped asking permission from anyone but yourself. A realtor I found through a fellow officer handled most of it remotely. I signed documents propped up against hospital pillows, my hand still weak, my signature, looking nothing like the confident scrawl I used to have. Within 2 weeks, the apartment had a buyer. Within 3, it had closed. I changed my phone number the same week, not out of spite, though I understand if it sounds that way. It was simpler than that. I needed a clean line between the life I had been living and the one I was choosing to build. I couldn't do that while carrying the same number my father might eventually think to call, the same number that connected me to a version of myself who kept hoping year after year that things would somehow be different. I requested a transfer. Colonel Whitfield, understanding more than he ever said aloud, helped expedite the paperwork. Within a month I had orders reassigning me to a base 3 states away, far enough that geography itself would make finding me an effort rather than an accident. I didn't tell anyone in my family. There was no dramatic phone call, no confrontation, no scene where I explained myself and gave them the chance to argue or apologize or perform whatever emotional gymnastics they might have offered. I had learned over many years that giving people explanations often just gives them material to twist. I was done handing over material. A JAG officer on base, a sharp, quiet man named Captain Reyes, helped me handle the more permanent paperwork, updating my will, reassigning my life insurance beneficiary, designating medical power of attorney to a fellow officer and close friend, a woman named Captain Diane Okafor, named coincidentally or not after my mother, though Diane herself had no idea about that particular residence when we first met years earlier. Every document I touched during that time had the same result. My father's name, once listed prominently as my primary contact for every major decision in my life, was quietly, methodically removed. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I didn't do any of this in anger. I did it in grief. There's a difference even if the actions look similar from the outside. Anger burns hot and often burns out. Grief is what remains after the fire, the slow, sober process of accepting that someone you loved is not who you needed them to be, and building a life that no longer depends on them changing. Meanwhile, back in the world, I'd left behind my father, and Linda returned home from Napa to an apartment that wasn't mine anymore. According to the building superintendent, whom I only spoke with once months later out of simple curiosity, my father showed up unannounced about 10 days after their return. He'd tried calling my old number and gotten a disconnected message. He'd tried texting with no response. Worry apparently had finally outpaced whatever comfortable denial Linda had constructed for him. He knocked on my old apartment door. A stranger answered, a young graduate student who had just moved in the week before. My father, according to the superintendent's account, stood in the hallway for a long moment, visibly confused, asking if perhaps he had the wrong unit. He didn't. He simply hadn't yet understood that his daughter was gone. The superintendent told him what little he knew that the previous tenant had sold, quickly moved out efficiently, and left no forwarding information. My father asked almost desperately if there was anything else, any detail at all. The superintendent, sensing something was wrong beneath the surface of the question, offered only a shrug and an apology. From there, according to what I learned much later, my father drove directly to the base. He arrived at the front gate that afternoon, presenting his ID, asking to see Major Lucy Price. The young private at the checkpoint, following standard protocol for a security matter he didn't fully understand, radioed it up the chain. The answer came back clean and absolute. Major Price was no longer stationed at this installation. "Where did she transfer to?" my father asked. "That information isn't authorized for release, sir." I imagine him standing there at that gate, the same gate I'd walked through hundreds of times over the years, feeling for the first time in his life what it meant to be locked out of something completely with no key and no explanation, and no one obligated to give him one. It was the first moment, as far as I can tell from everything I later learned, that real fear entered his chest. Not inconvenience, not mild worry. Actual fear, the kind that comes when you realize a person you assumed would always be reachable has become deliberately and completely unreachable. He called old army buddies who'd known me for years, asking if they'd heard anything. Most hadn't. A few had and chose out of loyalty to me to say nothing. He was, for the first time in longer than either of us could measure, forced to reckon with a truth he'd spent years avoiding. Somewhere along the way, without quite noticing it happening, he had lost his daughter completely. It took my father almost 2 months to request my full hospital records. I only know this because Captain Reyes, my JAG contact, mentioned it to me during a routine call about an unrelated matter, a courtesy heads up, since as next of kin on file. At the time of my admission, my father technically retained limited rights to certain hospital documentation, despite everything that had happened since. Reyes told me a formal request had come through and asked if I wanted to be informed when it was fulfilled. I told him I didn't need to know. I'd made my decision. What my father did with the truth, once he finally found it, was no longer my responsibility. But I've since learned what happened when those records reached him, because eventually he told me himself, in the one conversation we ever had about all of it months later than either of us probably wanted. He read through the entire file at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, Linda in the next room, unaware at first of what he was looking at. He told me his hands were shaking by the 3rd page. The clinical language: cardiac arrest, extended resuscitation note, patient's emergency contact declined to respond to multiple outreach attempts, hit him with a kind of brutal specificity that vague guilt hadn't managed to achieve in the 2 months prior. He read the timestamp of the first call to his phone. He read the timestamp of the second, the third, the fourth. He cross-referenced them. He told me against his own memory of that week in Napa, the wine tasting on day 2, the spa afternoon on day 4, the sunset dinner on the final night. Each medical crisis documented in that file lined up almost obscenely precisely with a moment of leisure he could specifically recall enjoying. He told me it felt like watching 2 versions of the same week superimposed on top of each other, one where his daughter was dying, and one where he was swirling wine in a glass with his arm around his wife's waist, smiling for a photograph. When he finally understood the full timeline, that Linda hadn't simply failed to mention a missed call, but had actively fielded and dismissed multiple direct communications from medical staff about his daughter's imminent risk of death, he confronted her. I wasn't there, obviously, so I can't describe the argument with the kind of detail I gave to my own hospital room or the vineyard photograph. But my father described it to me later as the worst fight of their marriage, worse even than anything from the early difficult years of blending our family. He told me Linda's defense never really changed, no matter how he phrased the accusation. She kept returning to the same core assertion that I exaggerated things, that I had always sought attention through drama, that surely the situation hadn't been as dire as the paperwork suggested, that doctors always inflate risk to cover themselves legally. "She almost died, Linda," he told me he'd said. "She died. For 11 minutes our daughter was dead, and you told the doctor to have her call back later." According to him, Linda didn't apologize. Not that day, not for weeks afterward. She held firm to her narrative, the same narrative she'd been constructing about me since I was 16 years old, that I was too sensitive, too needy, too eager to make myself the center of every situation. He told me it was the first time in their marriage he truly slammed his hand down on a table in anger, hard enough that a coffee mug jumped and cracked against the surface. He said it was the first time he looked at his wife and felt something closer to a stranger than a partner. But understanding what Linda had done and understanding what he himself had allowed are 2 very different reckonings. And it was the second one, the mirror turned back on himself, that seemed to break something loose in him. He started trying to find me in earnest after that, not the passive concern of a man waiting for his daughter to reach out first, but active, sustained searching. He drove to 2 other bases where he'd heard through old contacts that I might have been stationed. He called former commanding officers. He even, at one particularly low point he later admitted with visible shame, hired someone, a private investigator, briefly, before abandoning the effort when it produced nothing but dead ends and a hefty invoice. Everywhere he turned, the answer was some version of the same wall. Information not authorized for release. She doesn't wish to be contacted. I can't help you with that, sir. One former colleague of mine, a captain I'd served alongside years earlier, finally gave him something resembling an honest answer, though not the one he wanted. My father found him at a veterans event, cornered him, practically begged for any information about where I might be. The man looked at him for a long moment, my father told me, with an expression somewhere between pity and disappointment, and said simply, "She doesn't want to see you. I think you already know why." My father said that sentence undid him more than anything in the hospital file had, because it confirmed what he'd been afraid to admit to himself, that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. This was a door that had been closed on purpose by someone who had finally run out of reasons to keep it open. He drove home that night, he told me, and sat alone in his car in the driveway for nearly an hour before going inside. For the first time since I was 15 years old and standing beside my mother's casket, he understood what it actually felt like to lose a daughter. The difference this time was that I was still alive. I simply wasn't his anymore. 3 months after that conversation with my old colleague, I received word that I'd been selected for promotion. 3 years passed. I won't pretend they were easy years, though in many ways they were the most stable I'd had since my mother died. I threw myself into my career the way some people throw themselves into art or exercise or faith, as a place to put everything I couldn't otherwise process. I made lieutenant colonel. I built new friendships, real ones, with people who showed up not because blood obligated them to, but because they chose to again and again in the small, consistent ways that actually matter. I dated briefly a fellow officer named Marcus, though it didn't last, not because of anything dramatic, just the ordinary way some connections run their course. I adopted a dog, a scruffy mutt named Biscuit, who'd been found wandering near one of our training exercises and who became, in his own uncomplicated way, one of the steadiest presences in my life. I built, in other words, an entire existence that didn't require my father or Linda in it. And for the most part, I found peace in that. Not happiness exactly. I don't think peace and happiness are always the same thing, but a settled kind of okayness. The sense of a wound that had scarred over, rather than one still actively bleeding. I thought about them sometimes. Of course I did. You don't simply stop thinking about your own father because you've removed his name from a form. But the thoughts came less often as the months turned into years, and when they did come, they arrived with less sharpness than before, more like the dull ache of an old injury on a rainy day than the searing pain of something fresh. Then on an ordinary Tuesday in March, an envelope arrived at my current address, an address I was fairly confident no one from my old life should have had. There was no return address on the outside, just my name written in handwriting I recognized instantly, even after 3 years, even after everything. My father's handwriting. Careful, slightly slanted, the same hand that used to sign my school permission slips a lifetime ago, back when he was simply my dad, and not yet a man I'd had to legally remove from my emergency contacts. I sat with that envelope on my kitchen table for almost 2 full days before I opened it. Biscuit lay at my feet the whole time, as if he understood in his own animal way that something significant was unfolding. When I finally opened it, I found several pages handwritten front and back. He didn't try to make excuses. That surprised me more than almost anything else in the letter. I'd expected justifications, the kind of careful, self-serving narrative people construct when they finally decide to reach out after years of silence. Instead, he simply told me what he now understood. He wrote about reading my hospital file at his kitchen table, about the timestamps, about the coffee mug that cracked against the table the day he confronted Linda. He wrote about driving to bases looking for me, about the veterans event, about the colleague who told him I didn't want to be found, and that he probably already knew why. He wrote, "I spent years letting someone else decide how much attention your pain deserved. I told myself I was keeping the peace. What I was actually doing was choosing the person who made my life easier over the daughter who needed me the most. I don't expect you to forgive that. I'm not even sure I've forgiven myself for it." He wrote about my mother too, about how she used to say family means whoever shows up, and how he'd spent the last 3 years understanding with growing horror that he had simply stopped showing up for me long before that hospital ever called. There was no plea for reconciliation in the letter, no demand that I answer, no guilt-laced request for a phone call, just an accounting offered plainly of everything he now understood about the choices he'd made. The letter ended with a single line that I read perhaps a dozen times that evening, turning it over in my mind the way I'd once turned over Linda's vineyard photo caption, searching for whatever truth lived beneath it. I don't know if there's anything left to build between us, but I wanted you to know that I finally see what I lost. I hope wherever you are that you're happy. You deserve that, whether or not I'm the one who gave it to you. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after finishing it, Biscuit's head resting heavy against my ankle the March evening, turning slowly toward dusk outside my window. I want to tell you I felt triumphant, that some part of me lit up with vindication at finally being seen, finally being understood after years of silence. But that's not quite honest. What I actually felt was something quieter and more complicated, a kind of grief still, but a different flavor of it than before. Grief not for what had been done to me, but for what might have been if he had understood all of this 3 years or 10 years or even 20 years earlier. I didn't respond to the letter right away. I needed time to decide what, if anything, I wanted to do with what he'd finally handed me. But there was one more thing tucked inside that envelope beneath the folded pages of his letter. A cream-colored card, formal, the kind used for official military functions. An invitation to a ceremony 1 month away. I stared at it for a long time before I understood what he was asking without asking at all. My father arrived at the ceremony 45 minutes early. I know this because I saw him from a hallway near the staging area, pacing slowly across the polished floor of the auditorium, dressed in a suit that looked slightly unfamiliar on him, like he'd bought it recently and hadn't quite worn it in yet. He kept glancing toward the entrance, then toward his watch, then back toward the entrance again, the posture of a man who has spent 3 years imagining 100 different versions of a moment he's now finally about to live. I want to be honest about what I felt watching him from that hallway. There was no triumphant swell of vindication, no cinematic satisfaction. Mostly I felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. I hadn't told him what the ceremony was for, beyond the basic details on the invitation. He didn't know I was being formally recognized for actions during a field exercise the previous year, pulling 2 soldiers to safety during an equipment failure, actions the review board eventually classified as going well beyond the call of standard duty. He also didn't know I suspect that I'd requested his invitation be sent, not because I wanted a reunion, but because I wanted him to see, with his own eyes, exactly who I had become in the years since he'd let a kitchen countertop and a vineyard vacation matter more than his daughter's life. The auditorium filled slowly with families, uniforms, the low murmur of proud conversation. I stood near the front with my unit Biscuit's absence oddly present in my thoughts, even there since he'd become such a fixture of my daily life, that ceremonies like this one felt strange without his steady presence somewhere nearby. When my name was called, I walked forward the way I'd been trained to walk forward for over a decade, spine-straight steps, measured expression, composed. The commanding general read a brief citation about swift decision-making under pressure, about composure, that likely saved 2 lives. He pinned the medal to my uniform, shook my hand, and the room applauded. I found my father's face in the crowd during that applause. He was crying quietly, the kind of crying men his generation were taught to suppress in public tears, sliding down despite his obvious effort to hold them back. Linda was not there. He'd come alone. I noted that fact and set it aside without examining it too closely. After the ceremony ended, families spilled into the reception hall for coffee and quiet conversation, the kind of low-key gathering that follows most military recognitions. I saw my father making his way toward me through the crowd, and for a moment I watched him the way you might watch weather approaching from a distance, aware of what was coming, uncertain exactly how it would land. He stopped a few feet away from me. He didn't reach for a hug, though. I could see the impulse cross his face before he visibly restrained it. Something in my posture, I think, told him that particular gesture hadn't been earned yet, maybe wouldn't ever be earned in quite the way he wanted. "Lucy," he said, his voice thick. "You look—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right word, and settled on something simple. "You look strong." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Price," I said. I watched something crumple slightly in his face at that. Not dramatically, just a small visible flinch, the recognition of exactly what I was communicating by using his formal name instead of the word I used to call him every single day of my childhood. He nodded slowly, like he understood he had no right to expect anything different. "That's fair," he said quietly. "More than fair." We stood there for a moment in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but also wasn't hostile. The silence of two people who both understood that something significant had shifted permanently between them, and that no amount of conversation in a reception hall was going to undo 3 years of absence. "I read your letter," I told him, because he deserved to know that much. "I appreciate that you didn't make excuses in it. That matters. It doesn't fix everything, but it matters." "I know it doesn't fix anything," he said. "I wasn't trying to fix it. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I did, what I let happen because it was easier than fighting for you." I studied his face for a long moment, the new lines around his eyes, the gray that had crept further into his hair, the specific weariness of a man who has spent years living inside his own regret. Some small part of me, the part that used to be 15 years old and desperate for his attention after my mother died, wanted to soften completely in that moment, wanted to hug him and tell him it was all forgiven, that we could rebuild something from these ashes. But I'd learned over the past 3 years the difference between forgiveness and forgetting, between understanding someone's regret and pretending it erases what happened. I reached into the small bag I'd carried to the ceremony and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I handed it to him without any dramatic gesture, simply extending it the way you'd hand someone a document during any ordinary transaction. He unfolded it slowly, and I watched his eyes move down the page. A copy of my current emergency contact formed the official military document listing who should be called in the event of another crisis. His eyes found the line marked "Father" beside it in clean, unambiguous print, "Removed." He held that piece of paper for a long time, longer than it should take to read 4 words and a single line of print. I watched his thumb trace the edge of it, almost unconsciously, the way people touch things when they're trying to ground themselves against a truth too large to fully absorb standing up. "I understand," he finally said, and his voice had lost the thick, hopeful quality it carried when he first approached me. It was quieter now, steadier. The voice of a man accepting a verdict rather than arguing against one. "I didn't do this to punish you," I told him, and I meant it. "I did it 3 years ago in a hospital bed because I needed to survive losing you before I could actually start living again. I'm not handing you this today out of cruelty. I'm handing it to you because you deserve the truth the same way I deserved the truth for all those years I didn't have it." He nodded slowly, folding the paper back along its original creases with a careful, almost reverent motion, like he understood this document, however painful, was something he needed to keep. "For what it's worth," he said, "and I know it might not be worth much at this point, I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to become someone worth having back in your life. Not because I expect it, just because it's the right thing to try." I didn't respond to that with false hope or easy forgiveness. I simply nodded the way you acknowledge someone's intention without promising them an outcome you can't guarantee. "That's your choice to make," I said. "What I choose is mine." We didn't hug that day. We didn't cry together, didn't have some cathartic breakthrough that tied every loose thread into a neat bow. Real life rarely works that way, no matter how much we might wish it did. What we had instead was something quieter and more honest, an acknowledgement spoken plainly between 2 adults of exactly what had been lost and exactly what might or might not ever be rebuilt. He left the reception hall alone that afternoon. I watched him walk across the parking lot toward his car, shoulders slightly bowed, the posture of a man carrying something heavy that he'd finally agreed to stop pretending was light. I never found out what happened between him and Linda after that. I heard secondhand through an old family friend who still occasionally crossed paths with people from that part of my life that they eventually divorced about a year later. I felt no particular satisfaction in that news when it reached me. By then, I'd built enough distance and enough of my own peace that their marriage's fate no longer carried the emotional weight it once might have. As for my father and me, we exchange letters now occasionally, not often, not with the easy familiarity of a relationship that was never broken. but enough to know that he's still trying in his own imperfect way to become someone who shows up even years too late to have shown up when it mattered most. I think about my mother often when I consider all of this, about her simple belief that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up. I understand now in a way I couldn't, as a grieving 15-year-old, that showing up isn't a single grand gesture. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small choices made consistently over years long before any crisis ever arrives to test them. My father missed that test when it mattered most. Whatever he builds now, slowly, imperfectly, in the years he has left, will always exist in the shadow of that absence. That's not a punishment I'm inflicting on him. It's simply the natural consequence of choices he made alone in a vineyard in Napa, while his daughter's heart stopped beating 3 states away. I share this story not for pity and not even really for closure, because I'm not sure closure is a real thing so much as it's a direction you keep walking toward. I share it because I think so many of us carry some version of this same wound, the specific ache of loving people who, when it mattered most, chose something easier than us. If this story resonated with you, if some part of it reached into your own life and touched something you've carried quietly for years, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep walking through these stories together.